Welcome back to part 2 of our interview with the host of the Truer Crime podcast, Celisia Stanton. If you caught part 1, you know we left off at a really interesting point. So let's jump right back in. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I highly recommend starting there first. But for now, let's dive into part 2 of our conversation. So you touched on this, but I'm curious if you can maybe go a little bit deeper. Where do your ideas come from for episodes?
Yeah, so definitely ideas come from a lot of different sources. For me, I always wanted to be a true crime podcast. I didn't want to be seen as like the social justice podcast or, the true crime podcast with a Black host or like the history podcast. I wanted to be firmly in the true crime genre. And so, I felt like the place where I can make the most significant difference would be an episodic true crime, meaning different case every week versus a limited series, which is like one case told over, 8 to 10 episodes or something like that. And the reason I really wanted to do episodic true crime is because I felt like that's where we needed more nuance. That's where we needed to like really be able to dive deeper into cases because with a limited series, you're sort of inherently diving deeper just by nature of the fact that it's 8 to 10 episodes on a single case. You're going to get into those details. You're going to get into those nuances. And so with episodic true crime, sometimes it can feel like, somebody is just sort of parroting what they've read on Wikipedia or on like like online chat rooms or Reddit threads. It didn't always feel so original or insightful. And so I was like, what would it look like to sort of bridge the gap between those two worlds of limited series and episodic? And that's kind of, what I'm thinking about with true crime, with episodes is like, if I'm going to be a true crime podcast in the episodic realm, that means I have to be willing to cover any type of case because most episodic true crime, unless they're super niche down, like we only cover cases in the South or something like that, they're going to cover all types of cases. And so for me, I like to think that like most of the cases we do fit into, one of a few categories. One would be cases that are really infamous, right? So cases that are probably pretty well known, but that I feel like I can add a unique or different spin to. So for example, in season 1, I did an episode on Jonestown. That's a case that a lot of folks are familiar with. They've probably at least heard like the line, don't drink the Kool-Aid. But like a lot of people don't know that the majority of the folks that were killed at Jonestown or who died at Jonestown were Black folks, the majority of them Black women, that Jim Jones preached these, values of racial and class equity, and that's really how he attracted a lot of his followers to People's Temple, which is the cult that was behind Jonestown. And so those were really interesting dynamics to me. I was like, we talk a lot about the story, but not about those elements, Or take the Manson murders. That's a case that we covered in 2 episodes in season 2. And, again, everyone knows that case to some extent. Maybe they've seen some popular media that sort of like depicts it. Netflix literally just came out with a documentary on Manson this last week. But, most people don't know that Manson was preaching a coming race war, that this was really the motive behind the Tate LaBianca killings, that he tried to pin these killings on the Black Panthers. So these are elements that I thought were really interesting and, kind of naturally interested in me as someone with my perspective. And so I wanted to kind of highlight those things. And so a lot of times we'll do things like that. Another category I like to do is sort of cases that I think typically get relegated to like history, right? So like in season 1, we did an episode on the Tulsa Race Massacre. In season 2, we did an episode on the assassination of Martin Luther King. These are cases that oftentimes they're probably not going to be covered by any, true crime creators because they don't really see them as true crime cases. But to me, I was like, these are true crime cases. What would it look like to tell these really important stories, but give them the true crime treatment, right? True crime is such an addictive medium. I felt like this is a way to reach new people with stories that really matter. Because your typical true crime listeners probably not listening to the history podcast and vice versa. So I felt like this kind of would bridge the gap. And so for, like the Martin Luther King episode, for example, it was really interesting. I was talking to a lot of people in my life, asking them sort of what did they know about the assassination. And, people were like, honestly, in thinking about it, I'm kind of surprised. I don't really know that much. If they did know, a little bit, maybe here or there, they would say things like, oh yeah, like wasn't he shot by some assassin, like on some like motel balcony or something? And that's true. He was killed by a single bullet on a motel balcony in Tennessee. And there was a man who was convicted, who pled guilty and was convicted of the crime, James Earl Ray. But what most people don't know is that in 1999, Coretta Scott King, MLK's wife, alongside her children, sued a number of entities, including the US government, in a civil trial where they said, hey, the US government and all these other entities were involved in a conspiracy to kill King. And they won that trial. And this was in 1999. Like, this was not very long ago. But, like, this is something that most people don't know about at all. And, the King family believes that James Earl Ray, the man who went to prison and died in prison for the murder of King, they think he was set up. That's absolutely crazy to me. You have this figure, MLK, who is so, celebrated, and yet we don't know sort of like basic facts about his death. So I think that telling these historical stories in a true crime context, I think, was a way to kind of just raise awareness around these really important cases. And then also, I like to do stories that kind of like play with the traditional true crime format. I think that like sometimes, true crime can start to feel a little formulaic, where it's like, okay, you have the innocent, beautiful victim and you have this evil perpetrator who hopefully will be brought to justice. And I really felt like, to the name of the show, that wasn't really what was true, right? That wasn't really what crime looked like in the real world. And so I wanted to kind of tell stories that kind of highlighted that. So like, for example, in season 2, we covered the case of Alice Sebold, who is a really well-known author. She wrote this book called The Lovely Bones, which was adapted into a movie about, in like, I think, the 2010s. And she, before she wrote The Lovely Bones and kind of got famous for that, she had written a memoir called Lucky. And it actually chronicled her own experience in college, where she was raped by a stranger on the way back to her house after a party. And she ends up seeing the perpetrator on the street just a few months later. And she calls police. They're able to get this guy. His name is Anthony Broadwater. He's tried, he's found guilty, and he's served 16.5 years in prison for this assault. Turns out, we actually just found this out in the last few years, Anthony Broadwater was wrongfully convicted. She had misidentified him. It wasn't that Alice Sebold wasn't attacked. She was. It was that she had identified the wrong person. And that's really common, especially cross-racially, which it was in this case. Alice Sebold is white, Anthony Broadwater is black. And she made this sort of egregious mistake that would end up, impacting the entire rest of his life. And that's a story where it's like, wow, like, who is the victim? Who is the perpetrator? It's really confusing and messy and complicated and complex. And like, that's what I think crime looks like so often. So wanting to kind of do stories that highlight those things. And then, of course, just like more typical true crime stories, whether that be, we covered a case in season 2 about this young woman named Lauren McCluskey, who was killed by an ex-boyfriend after she had repeatedly reported his abuse to police over and over and over again. Or, a wrongful conviction. For example, we did in season 2 as well, the story of DeForest Johnson, who is a man who I believe is innocent, and he's currently on death row in Alabama. So these are stories that I think get covered a lot in true crime spaces, but really wanting to kind of hit on those as well, but just with, a different sort of perspective.
Well, I love the focuses that you have around trying to show us something about a case maybe we didn't know, or walking us through a case that isn't through the typical formula or typical lens. So I will just say up front, being a fan, being a follower of the podcast, knowing that there are 23,000 plus choices for true crime out there. Really well done, Celisia. So thank you for that. Great insight.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm just curious, you mentioned a few cases so far. Does one stand out as being maybe the most difficult for you?
I think all of the cases, all of the stories sit with me in different ways, and I have different connections to each of them. So, like, I don't want to say like there's one in particular, but certainly I think the ones where the stakes are still very high feel really important. So, like, for example, that case I was talking about DeForest Johnson, the man who is sitting on death row in Alabama right now, like as we speak. His case is just baffling when you like kind of really just dive into the details of how he was convicted, the evidence that they had against him, which was none, by the way. There was zero physical evidence that connected him to, it was a murder of a sheriff's deputy. And it was purely the statement of one 15-year-old girl who basically was essentially questioned by police hundreds of times or tens of times. She told hundreds of lies, prosecutors would later admit. And they basically kind of rode on her statement to convict him. And that case really sticks with me because the stakes are so high, right? He is on death row right now. This is truly life and death for him. The necessity to get the word out about his story is like so high. I'm working on another project right now for another series that is kind of a similar scenario where it's another man who is on death row. And those cases it's just really hard to I'll just be going about my daily life and just think like, it doesn't matter where I am, they're in the same place. They're in this cell in prison for a crime that they say they didn't commit, that there isn't a lot of evidence to support that they committed. And so those definitely stick in my mind for sure.
I'm only getting to know you, but clearly for me, your passion and your empathy really shine through. So I'm curious, have you had any challenges with balancing any ethical concerns when you're telling your stories, especially for the victims or their families?
Yeah, I think I try to do what I can to reach out to folks who are directly impacted, either for if they want to participate, but also because all the episodes I end with action items. So every single episode has a few different action items that, I encourage the listener to take based on the story they heard. And just it really is built into that mission that I was saying earlier of like, how can we take what is perhaps an entertaining story, but use that energy, the emotion it generated to go and do something impactful in your community. And so, we try to reach out to the people who are most directly impacted, whether it be victims, families, to see if there's anywhere that they would like to see support directed. And then, occasionally we're able to kind of work with those folks for an episode. Maybe they're featured in the episode as an interview, or maybe we do a bonus episode with them, or we do some kind of social media collaboration. I think one that sticks out to me is when I did the episode on Jonestown, I had reached out to a couple of the survivors of the Jonestown massacre, of which there are very few people who were actually there that day who survived. And they're extremely wary to talk to any kind of media because of how they were treated, especially in the media years after it happened. And so, they were very hesitant in talking with me and didn't necessarily want to go on the record, but, were interested in kind of sharing things to help support kind of those action items and to just kind of guide how I was thinking about the story. They were just kind of sharing, at least on background, some of their own perspective of how they viewed, being a part of People's Temple and what it meant to them. And that really helped shape kind of how I told the narrative. But one of the guys actually, he really wants to kind of reclaim his own story. He wanted to write a book, and so we were able to kind of directly to his Cash App for listeners to shoot him a donation if they wanted to, and he could use that if he wanted towards putting his story out there on his own terms. And so that was something he had reached out to me afterwards, and a large number of people did actually end up doing that. So I think that that's always, what I try to do to kind of counter some of that. But of course, I'm always open to any sort of critique, especially if, a family, doesn't want their story covered or disagrees with something. I said that hasn't happened yet, but I imagine that in telling these stories that are really sensitive, that are about the worst things that happen in people's life, that might happen down the line. And I think that just, I'm open and willing to having a conversation to just make sure that no matter what, when we're telling these stories, that we do have the people who are most directly impacted in mind.
Well, I think your approach is very thoughtful and it makes a ton of sense. So thank you for sharing that perspective. I'm kind of curious. You've been knee deep now for 5+ years at a minimum in true crime podcasting. Is the landscape changing? And if so, how are you adapting?
I mean, I think that for sure, like podcasting is a super young industry. I remember when I listened to my first podcast, which was Serial, like a lot of people, I was in college. I don't remember exactly what year this was, probably like 2015 or something like that. And, I had never listened to a podcast before. They had existed, but not really. I think Serial really helped blow up podcasting and, obviously true crime podcasting. And so that's really unique. I think that we think of other types of media, whether it be TV, movies, radio, these are all much older industries. And so there's some more established norms and all of that. So podcasting, it's all super emerging, it's developing, it's changing all the time. And I think, when if you got into podcasting like in, 2015, 2016, 2017, this was, maybe the golden age of like, you could just go put something out there and it would maybe blow up. That can still happen, but you have a lot more bigger players in the game. You have all these big networks, whether they be news networks or television networks who are kind of getting into the podcast game, kind of telling their own, telling stories that repurposing, their stories that they've told maybe on a docuseries and making it into a podcast, or maybe making a podcast that goes behind the scenes of like a popular television show or whatever it might be. And so, of course, that's more competition. I think that ultimately podcast listeners listen to lots of different shows. So I think that's great. But there's just a lot of content out there. And I think that's something that you're seeing across all types of media, right? Like social media creators, television shows, doesn't matter what it is. There's a million choices and you couldn't possibly as an individual person consume all of it. So I think, but I think it keeps people in the industry innovating, right? It's like, how can I stand out from the noise and create something truly different and unique that'll be compelling to listeners? And then, of course, there is like the monetary side of things, right? Like nobody can make anything unless they can, make money from it to pay their bills. And so, with podcasting, a lot of money is made off of like advertising, partnerships with the advertisers who will advertise on the shows. Sometimes people will have like Patreon or other sort of ways that they can kind of get funding directly from their community. And that's great too. But I think what's interesting about podcasting is it's free, right? You can listen to any show and you can listen to it for free pretty much. Maybe paying will get you certain benefits like ad free, or you'll get to listen early or something like that. But it's very accessible. I think as listeners, sometimes it's easy to forget that, and be like, oh, there's so many ads in this, or like, just get to the story. Why is this always, people don't want to feel like they're being sold to, but it's like, this is impossible unless we have advertisers who are willing to, help support the shows that we want to hear more from. So I think that that's kind of an adjustment. Is just trying to, always just kind of dealing with a shifting advertising landscape as things change. Advertisers are more or less interested in investing in podcasting or investing in true crime, even specifically, depending on what's going on. So it's definitely a dynamic industry, and I imagine that it's going to remain that way.
So I'm curious. In every interview I've conducted so far on this podcast, we've covered the emerging role of AI in their respective industries. Does AI play a role in what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because, again, very new. And so like when I made my first season, AI had zero role because it didn't exist, or I didn't know it existed. It certainly wasn't accessible to anybody. It was being developed, I'm sure. In season 2, much of I think I remember like when ChatGPT came out, it was like I was working on producing season 2, and just kind of I'd messed around with ChatGPT, but it didn't have any role in the show because it really couldn't. I didn't fully know how to like utilize it, and it was so brand new. And now, yeah, definitely I'll like, it is nice. I think when you have like really small teams, like, you're working at like a smaller company or a startup, it can be great to, if there are ways that you can use like human ingenuity and pair it with AI in order to like become more efficient, whether that be, help with some editing or, help coming up with a really compelling hook for social media content or something like that. So, I definitely am super wary on like the research front because AI is incorrect a lot of the time, especially when it comes to research. So I think, I don't think we're there yet on completely being able to fully utilize it as you would like a person, like a producer, or a writer, or a researcher. But I definitely have found it to be a handy tool. And I think that, of course, hopefully there continues to be conversations about like, how do we work with AI versus like just being kind of replaced by AI. But I don't know exactly where things are going. And I imagine that, we're on this path that we're on. There's no way that it's not going to be majorly disruptive, not just in media, but in every industry imaginable, especially anyone that requires you to be sitting at a computer. And so, yeah, I'm just be interested to see how we have to continue to adapt.
Well said. Couldn't agree more. Now on the lighter side, I'm just curious, when you're not true criming it, what else do you listen to?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I do listen to a lot of true crime podcasts. I really like, but outside of that, I like, I'm a big fan of a lot of the New York Times podcasts. I like a show that they came out with this year called Wirecutter, and it's based on like their popular, website Wirecutter, which is like they do like, really in-depth, product reviews and analysis and all of that. Like they're the people that will like test out 100 mattresses to find the best one. So I've really enjoyed their podcast because they have some really fun, interesting topics. And I've learned a lot. So like I remember they had a episode on dishwashers, which is kind of interesting, but I learned quite a bit about like how a dishwasher should work and whether or not you should rinse your dishes before you put them in. And also like a really interesting history of the dishwasher. Like it's like one of the oldest appliances that exists. We've actually had like a version of the dishwasher for like 150 years, which is kind of insane. That like that's a super long time. And it was developed by a woman who was kind of sick of, she was like a socialite, I guess, who was sick of her like nice china getting chipped every time that it had to be hand washed. So she kind of developed this this early version of the dishwasher and then became what it is today. They have had topics about, fireproofing your home or, how to have like, host the best Thanksgiving and things like that. So I really like that kind of lifestyle stuff. I consume a lot of political podcasts as well, and sort of like perspective driven politics stuff. And I really like the show Normal Gossip, which is like, I think probably the most opposite to true crime that I can think of, but like kind of scratches a similar itch in that it's these stories about like these crazy gossip stories that are like anonymized, that real people have experienced. And it's just kind of a fun sort of like listen where you can kind of get into the lives and drama of other people, but it's kind of low stakes. There's no one's ever hurt. It's not ever anything that would have had some like terrible lasting impact, but it's really fun and funny. And they always have a different guest on every week. So those are some of my favorites.
Well, great recommendations. You've been so gracious with your time. So before we wrap, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, for anybody who's interested in kind of like jumping off into podcasting or any kind of entrepreneurial venture, like we were talking about earlier, I just really recommend just going for it, just trying to put yourself out there. I think, one of a quote that always sticks out to me is that it's easier to critique than create. And I think a lot of times people like hold off on creating because like they're afraid of the critique or what people might think. But like the reality is that, creating things is a vulnerable thing. It does require putting yourself out there, but you're doing the hard thing, right? It's easy to kind of judge other people from the outside. It's the hard thing to actually go and put yourself out there. So I really encourage people to give it a try, and see what they come up with, kind of continue to hone their craft. And I also have a newsletter called Sincerely Celisia, which is a weekly newsletter I put out every week. And it's free to sign up. It's sincerelycelicia.substack.com. And it's not true crime related. I'll kind of like just share things I'm reading or eating, recipes I'm doing, things I'm buying, all that good stuff. But if you look in the archives of previous posts, I did do a whole post specifically about getting started in podcasting. It's called Podcasting 101. And it really just talks about here's the equipment I bought, here are the guides I used, and all of that for anyone who's looking to kind of just get out there and get started.
Well, thanks for that. Congrats on your success. Loved having you on today. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciated it.
And that concludes our 2-part interview with Celisia Stanton, host of Truer Crime. I really appreciate you tuning in and supporting the podcast. We can't wait to bring you more exciting episodes. But don't go anywhere just yet. Stay tuned for an exclusive preview of Celisia's podcast. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, I'm Celisia Stanton, and I was robbed of my entire life savings by someone I thought I could trust. But hold up. Let's rewind. For years, like you, or at least like someone you know, I kept coming back to this captivating and questionable genre, true crime. Growing up, I watched reruns of Forensic Files. Later on, I binged Netflix specials, got lost in the fiction of Criminal Minds, and read long-form investigative journalism here and there. Serial was the podcast that got me into podcasts. Then 2020 hit, and in the middle of the pandemic, I was the victim of a huge financial scheme, one that defrauded me of tens of thousands of dollars. And before I knew it, I found myself caught in a tangled web of tears, cops, and courts. Violence wasn't necessarily new to me, but this was. Suddenly, I was learning firsthand what the justice and criminal justice really meant. And I'm still not sure why, but in my grief over what had happened to me, I found myself turning again to true crime. Hearing story after story somehow helped me cope. It was weird, and maybe it was numbing, and maybe it was just something to do, but either way, I kept listening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the picture just felt so incomplete. I found myself with lots of questions. Does the story really end with a headline arrest or a guilty verdict? How can we actually support victims? And what if the perpetrator, the criminal, is the government? The same government that decides what counts as crime in the first place. What does justice really mean? And who is it really for? People have been telling true stories about real crimes since way before we came up with the label true crime. Cautionary tales around the campfire, narratives by enslaved people like Solomon Northrop's 12 Years a Slave, real mystery stories like the old magazine True Detective. As Rachel Monroe wrote in her book, Savage Appetites, true crime can reveal the anxieties of the moment, tell us who's allowed to be a victim, and teach us what our monsters are supposed to look like. It's easy to criticize true crime as sick entertainment, but we can't deny that the way that these stories are told has a profound impact on how we view our world. So I don't think the answer is to stop telling them. In fact, I think we need to go deeper. So I created Truer Crime to do just that. Every week, we'll talk about real people, real crimes, and the real systems that shaped it all. Expect lots of research, lots of nuance, and lots of questions. From Tenderfoot TV, Truer Crime is available now. Listen for free on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.